world is in grave danger. Climate destabilization, rampant industrialization, environmental destruction, urban pollution, species extinction. These problems are significantly impacting our natural world. The environmental movement was launched to protect our natural world, control pollution, and to protect animal and plant diversity. This presentation will focus on neglected pioneers in the environmental movement, as well as a few well-known figures. We will explore the work of educators, practitioners, philosophers, and influential harbingers of change who have been celebrated in Europe and South America, but may be little known in the United States. Instead of focusing on popular historical figures in the environmental movement, like Henry David Thoreau, Rachel Carson, and John Muir, we will instead turn our lens on professionals on the periphery of the sustainable design and green building realm. We will explore how anarchy, libertarian socialism, decentralization, and other belief systems have changed a role in architecture, urban planning, and in overcoming environmental challenges. The authors of this presentation do not advocate or endorse the beliefs, views, or opinions of the individuals discussed. The learning objectives of this presentation include: architecture and anarchy would appear to be completely at opposite ends of the spectrum. A hierarchical structure, laws, regulations, building codes, timelines, budgets, safety issues, and many other factors result in architecture being orderly and hopefully well planned.
So when I think of the word anarchy, I think most simply it can be defined as without rulers. Or to put it a different way, it's to envision a society in which we are all rulers, or all have agency over our lives, and that we can make the decisions that actually impact our lives. Anarchism and other political ideals related to decentralization and autonomy have impacted the environmental movement in a variety of ways, one of which I would suggest is where we look for solutions. To think about decentralization, to think about autonomy, and to think about solutions is to suggest not that there is some sort of central authority that is the place in which solutions to our environmental problems will be found, but rather that we should look and ask communities themselves to determine for themselves what the solutions to these problems might be.
Well, I think anarchy is the state of living free of oppressive bureaucracies, institutional bureaucracies, and social hierarchies. So it's the ability to kind of live life and interact with the earth and on your own terms. Anarchism has always been about abolishing the state and capitalism, and so those are main, institutional, bureaucracies in a larger sense that obviously need to be abolished before we have anarchy. I don't think anarchy ever has proposed a social utopia in that everyone's always going to get along, but I think what we see with massive, state bureaucracies is that we've seen a complete inability of people to be able to control what they do.
The French geographer Elisée Reclus states that anarchistic society has long been in a process of rapid development. Wherever free thought breaks loose from the chains of dogma, wherever the spirit of inquiry rejects the old formulas, wherever the human will asserts itself through independent actions, wherever honest people, rebelling against all enforced discipline, join freely together in order to educate themselves and to reclaim, without any master, their share of life and the complete satisfaction of their needs. Reclus was an early prognosticator of globalization, a critic of the domination of humanity in nature, and influenced such thinkers as urban planner Patrick Geddes and author James Joyce. Reclus advocated nature conservation and was a dedicated vegetarian. Reclus' geographical studies of humans and nature interacting are considered the precursor to bioregionalism. Elisée Reclus was born at Saint-Foy-le-Grand, France, in 1830. His father was a Protestant minister and professor at a nearby college. His mother conducted a school for girls and raised 13 children. Reclus studied as a child in mainly Protestant institutions where he learned various languages such as German, Latin, English, and Dutch. By the time he was a teenager, he had been exposed to several cultures and had a strong belief in universal justice and human solidarity. After completing his university studies in Berlin, Reclus left France and traveled the world. His plan was to explore the Americas and establish an agricultural community. After arriving in New Orleans in 1853, Reclus obtained a position as a tutor for a wealthy family on a plantation. He spent over 2 years on the banks of the Mississippi River, documenting the cruel inhumanity of slavery. In his book, Voyage to New Orleans, he wrote that he could no longer accept money by tutoring the children of slaveholders, and thus steal from the slaves who by their sweat and blood have earned the money that I put in my pocket. He argued that by staying on the plantation and participating in such an institution, it is indeed I who hold the whip. Furthermore, in his book, he documents the atrocities of an antebellum slave auction. He observes, all of the slaves of Louisiana pass in turn on this fateful table, children who have just ended their 7th year, and whom the law, in its solicitude, deems old enough to be separated from their mothers. Young girls subjected to the stares of 2,000 spectators and sold by the pound. Mothers who come to see their children stolen from them, and who are obliged to remain cheerful under threat of the whip, and the elderly who have already been auctioned off many times, and who appear one last time before these pale-faced men who despise them and jeer at them. Slavery and the oppression of people of color would have a lasting impression on Reclus and influence his theories. After leaving Louisiana, he failed at setting up a cooperative agricultural community in South America. Finally, he returned to France to become a scientist, writer, and activist. In the 1860s, he published his multi-volume work, The Earth, as well as The Story of a Brook, a natural history book that became popular with young audiences. Reclus' work foreshadows present-day ecological studies. He criticized settlers in the Americas who burned old-growth forests to develop farms. At the same time, burning the animals, blackening the sky with smoke, and casting to the wind ashes that scatter over hundreds of kilometers. Reclus recommended that the Earth ought to be cared for like a great body, in which the breathing is carried out by means of the forests, regulates itself according to a scientific method. It has lungs which ought to be respected by humans, since their own hygiene depends on them. Furthermore, he states, the brutal violence with which most nations have treated the nourishing earth has been foremost among the causes that have vanquished so many successive civilizations. Reclus advocated that humanity should have an environmentally sound and virtuous relationship with the natural world. He said, by means of its fields and roads, by its dwellings and every manner of construction, by the way it arranges the trees and the landscape in general, the populace expresses the character of its own ideals. If it really has a feeling for beauty, it will make it more beautiful. If, on the other hand, the great mass of humanity should remain as it is today, crude, egoistic, and inauthentic, it will continue to mark the face of the earth with its wretched traces. Thus will the poet's cry of desperation become a reality. Where can I flee? Nature itself has become hideous. Reclus helped coin the term social geography, which is a branch of human geography. Human geography deals with the world, its peoples, and their communities and cultures by emphasizing their relations of and across space and place. Social geography would evolve over the next century and would be used to develop studies for some of the first spatial examinations of racial segregation and social inequality in cities in the 1960s. Reclus wrote extensively about cities and urban renewal issues. He believed that cities cannot achieve their destiny as centers of human self-realization as long as there is economic disparity and political domination. He asserts, in a society in which people cannot depend on having enough bread to eat, in which the poor and even the starving make up a large part of the population of every large city, it is no more than a halfway measure to transform unhealthy neighborhoods if the unfortunate people who previously inhabited them find themselves thrown out of their former hovels only to go in search of new ones in the suburbs, merely moving the poisonous emanations a certain distance away. In addition, Reclus focuses his criticism on the suburbs. He states, unfortunately, this reflux from the cities towards the outskirts does not occur without defacing the countryside. Not only does the debris of all sorts clutter the intermediate space between city and field, but even worse, speculators grab up all of the charming sites in the vicinity, divide them into rectangular plots, enclose them with monotonous walls, and then build hundreds and thousands of pretentious little houses. To pedestrians wandering along the muddy roads in this would-be countryside, the only nature in evidence is the trimmed shrubs and clumps of flowers glimpsed through the fences. Wild nature is so beautiful. Is it really necessary for man, in seizing it, to proceed with mathematical precision in exploiting each new conquered domain, and then mark his possession with vulgar constructions and perfectly straight boundaries?
I think in terms of urban planning and urban development as an entire field, we can look back to Haussmann's Paris, one of the founders, of the entire field of urban development. And Haussmann's Paris he came in for Napoleon and developed a city planning model that had a two cornerstone approach of how do we, on one hand, beautify the city, and on the other hand, make it impervious to urban insurrections. And I think that from there, the field of urban development and urban planning has really been informed by this idea of how do we solve urban problems while, not addressing the fundamental social inequalities that are at its root. And I think in Portland, we can definitely see that happening with the way that the city has gone about its development from, the blight clearance that was happening in the, 50s with the Emmanuel Hospital expansion, with the, some of the freeway expansions that were happening that, basically came in and cleared out huge swaths of, the black community under this guise of blight clearance.
Noted sociologist and urbanism critic Richard Sennett said, "The cities everyone wants to live in should be clean and safe, possess efficient public services, be supported by a dynamic economy, provide cultural stimulation, and also do their best to heal society's divisions of race, class, and ethnicity. These are not the cities we live in. Cities fail on all these counts due to government policies, irreparable social ills, and economic forces beyond local control. The city is not its own master. Still, something has gone wrong, radically wrong, in our conception of what a city itself should be. Perhaps those nice words, clean, safe, efficient, dynamic, are not enough in themselves to confront critically our masters." Anarchist ideals, anti-authoritarian philosophies, self-managed forms of organization, and other theories of social organization have influenced everything from experimental design to architect Walter Siegel's do-it-yourself housing. Siegel became angry at the high cost of land extensive building regulations, and lending institutions in England. Siegel developed a process where anyone could build a house cheaply and quickly. People with no previous construction experience could utilize basic tools such as a saw, hammer, drill, tape measure, etc. to build a house. Siegel helped create low-cost structures which could be adapted with changing needs and as incomes rose. Anarchist ideology has played a role in the development of architecture in urban and regional planning, and has helped to create decentralized communities with a large degree of autonomy and self-sustainability. The Garden City movement, launched in the early 20th century, advocated self-contained communities surrounded by green space containing proportionate areas of residence, industry, and agriculture. The Garden City would be self-sufficient, and when it reached full population, another Garden City would be developed nearby. Ebenezer Howard was the founder of the Garden City movement. Howard aimed to reduce the alienation of humans and society from nature, and hence advocated garden cities. Garden cities were designed to avoid the downfalls of industrial cities of the time, such as urban poverty, overcrowding, low wages, dirty alleys with no drainage, poorly ventilated houses, toxic substances, dust, carbon gases, infectious disease, and lack of interaction with nature. Howard's ideas would later influence modern town planning and landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. In 1898, Howard published his book, Tomorrow, A Peaceful Path to Real Reform. His garden city would house 32,000 people on a site of 6,000 acres, built on a concentric pattern with open spaces, public parks, and 6 radial boulevards extending from the center. The garden city would be self-sufficient, and when it reached full population, another garden city would be developed nearby. Howard planned a cluster of several garden cities as satellites of a central city of 250,000 people, linked by road and rail. Only 2 English towns were built as garden cities, Letchworth and Welwyn. Though they did not completely measure up to his vision, they provided a model for controlling urban sprawl. The city of Letchworth, officially known as Letchworth Garden City, is located in southeastern England. The town was laid out by prominent engineer Raymond Unwin, according to the principles established by Ebenezer Howard. It was the world's first garden city and home to the United Kingdom's first roundabout. Howard advocated the construction of a new kind of town, summed up in his 3 magnets diagram as combining the advantages of cities and the countryside while eliminating their disadvantages. Industry would be kept separate from residential areas. Such zoning was a new idea at the time, and trees and open spaces would prevail everywhere. The founding citizens of Letchworth, attracted by the promise of a better life, were often caricatured by outsiders as idealistic and otherworldly.
When I think about urban sprawl and its impacts, 2 things come to mind. Its environmental impacts and its human impacts. Environmentally, I think that urban sprawl simply takes up more and more and more of the habitat and natural areas that are surrounded, that surround our cities or are enmeshed within them. And connected to that, it does so in a way that furthers a kind of hyper-individualistic way of living. We each kind of carve out our own space in which we all have the same things, the same lawnmowers, the same kitchens, the same set of resources that not only can be more effectively shared in common, but also in so doing create a sense of community, a sense of connectedness that I think is something that's really missing in our society. So urban sprawl not only has these detrimental impacts on the habitats and other ecosystems of our region, but also has detrimental impacts on ourself as well in the way in which it affects and erodes human communities.
Poor people and people of color have been pushed further and further outside of, the city core and out into the old white suburbs as the city has tried to, bring money back into the city center area to not become like another Detroit. We look at what's going on right now with the city of Portland initiating these sweeps against all of the homeless camps in the inner city to clear up the city for the Rose Parade, where they're pushing houseless folks, further and further outside of the city, breaking up camps where people are finding places to rest their heads and not really giving them any tangible alternatives. And so it's really this process of push out the people you don't want and clean up the city under the broken windows theory to make it look nice and happy for economic elite and the people with the financial resources that the city wants to bring in to these communities. And these communities were created by poor artists and poor working class people that created these communities that at one time, you look at North Portland, it was an area that was just totally stigmatized by the rest of the city. You did not want to go there 20 years ago. Downtown Portland, it was the same thing. Crime, you don't want to go downtown, this, that, the other thing. Well, people that lived in these, impoverished circumstances made communities that were livable. And the city came in and said, you made these areas that were livable, let's figure out a way to exploit that. Right now we're seeing urban renewal areas pop up out on the east side in Portland, and bring in the artists, allow the artists to develop here and start building culture, make the neighborhoods more desirable. While on the other hand you have amped up police resources and patrolling and coming around and going after the people that they identify as undesirables, right? The people that don't have the rights to the city that everyone else does, and to push those people out, bring in the people you want. And I think it's a process that we see time and time again.
The architect Giancarlo De Carlo was a well-known figure in Italian design. He was a libertarian socialist and highly influenced by anarchy. De Carlo supported participatory architecture, in which the architect works with the inhabitants to create the plans and designs. He rejected state ownership and command of means of production, supported worker self-management, decentralized structures of political government, and dismantling of illegitimate authority in all aspects of human life. De Carlo believed that housing was one of the most significant problems in society. He says, "It is enough to go around Italy, visiting towns and villages, seeing the places where men are born, to multiply and die, and the houses they live in, to realize that our whole social body is in a state of decomposition, and that only the most radical and energetic remedies can cure it. Overcrowding prevents the dwelling from fulfilling its primary function. It ceases to be an environment where fruitful human relationships can unfold, and becomes a dangerous instrument of physical and moral degradation, a vehicle of sickness and death." In the 1940s, De Carlo argued that the working-class dwellings in his country were little different than that of slaves' quarters in imperial Rome. He blamed the state on the failure to resolve the housing crisis, and said that even with new construction methods and materials, the crisis could not be solved due to principles of privilege and authority. De Carlo blamed the Italian government for building ugly and badly constructed housing for the poor. He says, "The housing problem cannot be solved from above. It is a problem of the people, and it will not be solved, nor even boldly faced, except by the concrete will and action of the people themselves. So it will be useful to examine the validity and the limits of the types of direct action for houses that have so far been seen: building cooperatives, illegal occupation of empty houses, and housing strikes." De Carlo proposed squatting as a direct form of action to fight the housing crisis. Squatting exists in many poorer countries around the world. Slums and shantytowns are often built on the edges of major cities and consist of self-constructed dwellings built without the landowner's consent. Many of the squatter areas have no sewage system, drinkable water, or electricity. In recent years, in the United States, squatters have moved into foreclosed homes. Other squatter settlements are punk houses, abandoned buildings occupied by homeless people, and crack houses filled with gang members. Some squatters have also engaged in urban homesteading, where they take over abandoned private properties, rehabilitate a building through their own labor, and work collaboratively to attempt to take full ownership of the building. In the 1940s, DiCarlo argued that the sickness of the home coincides with that of the city. He says, "Urban planning conceived as a technical means of saving the present social structure, of damming up the pressing realities of life, is a dangerous delusion. But conceived in a different way, as the manifestation of communal collaboration, it becomes an endeavor to liberate the true existence of man, the attempt to establish a harmonious connection between nature, industry, and all human activities. And it is far more than a question of traffic, means of transport, or the aesthetics of the building." Urban planning can become a revolutionary weapon if we succeed in rescuing it from the blind monopoly of authority and making it a communal organ of research and investigation into the real problems of social life. DiCarlo never separated architecture from politics. He was active in the Italian anti-fascist resistance and a strong supporter of workers' rights. When he was building social housing for a large steel company in a town right outside of Rome, he made many demands. First, the steelworkers who would inhabit the housing project would be involved in the design process. Second, the steel company had to pay the workers for these design brainstorming sessions. And finally, management was banned from attending the design sessions. DiCarlo's strong views extended to the function and architecture of university buildings. He opposed the traditional idea of a campus. He says, "The university must be an active, open part of society, of the town, towards which it has both rights and duties. Usually it takes its rights, but it is less concerned with its duties. Just as the university is using the city and its territory, in the same way the university should reciprocate and be usable by the city and its territory. If a university is really worthy of the name, every citizen should be free to enter and listen to a lecture. You could say, well, what stops anyone from attending a lecture now? I believe the answer is the architecture itself. Thresholds, for instance, are the expression of authority and institutionalization. And the most important barriers are those thresholds which you cannot touch. The issue of easing access should be much more important than simply concern for disabled entrances. In a way, we are all disabled when we cannot use a particular space."
Fossil fuels have a variety of negative impacts on cities. First and foremost, the burning of fossil fuels creates dangerous particulates that have serious health impacts on the communities that live closest to those areas that have the highest concentrations of that particulate matter. So you think of the consequences of burning diesel, gasoline, and other things, and what that means for families and children in particular that live along those corridors in which those fossil fuels are burnt. So there's a clear social justice component to the burning of fossil fuels at the source in which they're burned, not to mention similar impacts of power plants and other sources of burning. Additionally, some of my work is very much associated around climate change. And so when we think about the burning of fossil fuels, we can think about the ways in which that is transforming the climate of the planet and impacting cities in all kinds of different ways, whether that's by creating drought, affecting water supplies, changing migration patterns, doing different kinds of things like that. And I think that's clearly something we have to keep in mind with fossil fuels. But additionally, at the level of thinking about the urban form and the consequences of fossil fuels and the reliance on combustion engines and automobiles and individualized transportation has dramatically changed and shaped our cities in ways that are not only detrimental for the environmental reasons I've discussed, but also have tremendous impacts on our abilities to foster and create human community within our cities. A huge amount of the landmass in cities is taken up by parking lots, streets, and other infrastructure dedicated to the transportation of vehicles that run on fossil fuels. Additionally, it severs communities. Streets are kind of impassable pathways that make it so that individuals or families across the street from one another are literally kept apart by a dangerous obstruction between them. And so I think it's important to think about how the use of cars has transformed cities in the United States and elsewhere over the last 80 years or so, and how we might envision alternatives, not only to fossil fuels, but the forms of transportation they're most associated with, that not only can impact our environment, but also provide a context in which we can address social justice issues and human communities in that we can make them more stronger.
One of the most well-known proponents of radical change that we will discuss today is author and urban activist Jane Jacobs. She championed community-based approaches to urban planning, rejected professional authority, and glorified the self-organizing ability of urban environments. In her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, written in 1961, Jacobs critiques urban planning policy. She argued that modernist urban planning rejects the city because it rejects human beings living in a community characterized by layered complexity and seeming chaos. Jacobs recommends 4 pillars of effective city neighborhood planning. To foster lively and interesting streets. To make the fabric of the streets as continuous a network as possible throughout a district of potential subcity size and power. To use parks, squares, and public buildings as part of the street fabric, intensifying the fabric's complexity and multiple uses rather than segregating different uses. To foster a functional identity at the district level. Jacobs viewed cities as living beings and ecosystems. Parks, neighborhoods, economy, and sidewalks melded together similar to a natural ecosystem. Jacobs frames the sidewalk as a central mechanism in maintaining the order of the city. To Jacobs, the sidewalk is a stage for an intricate ballet in which the individual dancers and ensembles all have distinctive parts, which miraculously reinforce each other and compose an orderly whole. Jacobs believed that one of the challenges in a city is to make its inhabitants feel safe, secure, and socially integrated in the midst of an overwhelming volume of rotating strangers. The healthy sidewalk is a critical mechanism for achieving these ends, given its role in preventing crime and facilitating contact with others. Noting that a well-used street is apt to be relatively safe from crime, while a deserted street is apt to be unsafe, Jacobs suggests that a dense volume of human users deters more violent crimes, or at least ensures a critical mass of first responders to mitigate disorderly incidents. She argues that residents in places with no sidewalk life are conditioned to avoid basic interactions with strangers, especially those of a different income, race, or educational background, to the extent that they cannot imagine having a deep personal relationship with others so unlike themselves. Jacobs once said, "Designing a dream city is easy. Rebuilding a living one takes imagination. That the sight of people attracts still other people is something that city planners and city architectural designers seem to find incomprehensible. They operate on the premise that city people seek the sight of emptiness, obvious order, and quiet. Nothing could be less true. The presences of great numbers of people gathered together in cities should not only be frankly accepted as a physical fact, they should also be enjoyed as an asset and their presence celebrated." Jacobs advocated mixed-use development, community-guided design, high-density projects, and local economies. Jacobs was also a passionate activist. In 1968, she was arrested on riot charges for disrupting a public meeting on the construction of an expressway that would have sliced across Manhattan and displaced hundreds of families and businesses. She dissented against American involvement in Vietnam and was arrested at an anti-war protest.
Well, when I think about direct action, I think of it as taking action as if we were already free, as if we already had the agency unconstrained by whatever kinds of authorities or law might exist to really do those things that we felt were right and just and needed to be done in this moment. It often takes the form of, rather than being symbolic, directly impacting the issues we may be working on, whether that's deforestation, environmental justice issues, climate change, or whatever the case might be. A couple of examples that come to mind for me when I think about this is one here in Portland where I am, when there was a debate about what to do with the area near the Willamette River that runs through downtown Portland. And a group of people took direct action by setting up a picnic in the median of what was then a 6-lane expressway called Harbor Drive. They put their children on leashes so that they wouldn't run into traffic, and in doing so, both envisioned what that space would look like if it would become a park, which it eventually did, in part thanks to their action, and also did so against whatever rules might have been. Certainly picnics were not allowed in the median. Another example that comes to mind for me are the climate camps or the climate convergences that occurred in the United Kingdom and the United States, in which people took action to often seize space. In the United Kingdom, there was entire communities created in interesting formations and relationship to one another within that community on the site of spaces of climate change importance. So people created a climate camp where the Drax power plant is in northern England, along what would have been the 3rd runway at Heathrow Airport. And in so doing, not only would then take action trying to stop the coal terminal as they did, preventing construction on a runway, but also at the same time envisioning an alternative society based on some of the ideals that we've discussed thus far.
One of the main tenets in anarchy and libertarian socialism is freedom. Liberty and equality are highly regarded in these political philosophies, in addition to minimizing authority. Decentralization and people making their own decisions about their lives is paramount. Architect John F.C. Turner argues that housing is most successful when produced through the autonomy of its residents. He says, when dwellers control the major decisions and are free to make their own contributions in the design, construction, or management of their housing, both this process and the environment produced stimulate individual and social well-being. When people have no control over, nor responsibility for, key decisions in the housing process, on the other hand, dwelling environments may instead become a barrier to personal fulfillment and a burden on the economy. Turner worked in Peru in the 1950s and 60s and published landmark papers on squatter settlements and the role of communities in building cities. He was a research associate at Harvard and MIT. He strongly endorses autonomy and dweller control, the freedom to budget one's own resources and freedom to shape one's own environment. Turner says, the critical issue is decision-making, not laboring. The emphasis is always on personal and local or social. Social, however, must not be understood as governmental any more than society should be confused with the state. He advocates bottom-up participatory development as opposed to paternalistic top-down approaches. In the late 1960s, Turner published the essay, The Squatter Settlement, Architecture That Works. He discusses how squatters in Peru invest their life savings into an environment that the squatter creates. Turner says, typically, he and his very young family have escaped from the depredations of the inner-city slumlord, often a renter of clandestine shacks, and start building a permanent house. Because the poor are the majority in Lima, and because the government controls neither the material nor the human resources for the satisfaction of essential housing needs, the poor must act for themselves, and if the official rules and regulations get in the way, along with any policemen who may be sent in to enforce them, are generally swept aside. The man who would be free must build his own life. The most important architectural advantage of the squatter's procedure is the consequent adaptability of space and structure to the changing needs and behavior patterns of the family. If they were trapped in the inner cities, like so many of the North American poor, they would be burning instead of building.
We have, again, a housing epidemic on our hands where we have, over 1 million people in this country that are homeless and houseless, and so and we have twice as many abandoned houses, and so it just doesn't make sense to have homeless people in a country where we have that many houses that are just sitting vacant. And so I think it makes sense for people to go to those houses and occupy them, to get that shelter. It's a basic human need, so it makes sense, but capitalism says that that's not legal, and so it enforces this insane policy on laws on everyone, where we have people that have to sleep in the streets even though we have houses, because that's just the law, and that's the way that we've decided culturally to do things, I suppose. And squatting is a great way of getting those basic needs met, and it is direct action. So direct action is enacting the change that you want to see yourself directly, to live that life that you want to lead, or get your needs met. And I think we look at places like when Occupy was happening and the campers camping in city centers across the country. I think for me that was a pretty revolutionary thing to have thousands of people across the country coming together in these spaces that, since the enclosure of the commons, increasingly public places like parks and things, they're just places where people can sit and walk through, maybe sit and read a book, hang out for a second. It's not a place where somebody is allowed to sleep or occupy or use in that way. We have very restricted ways that we can interact with the space. In Portland, we have the no sit, no lie law, where you cannot even sit on a sidewalk. It's not legal, but of course, if you're a businessman wearing a suit, you're not going to have to worry about a police officer coming up and hassling you for sitting on a sidewalk. What it's designed to do is to say, homeless people, you cannot live in the city. You have to keep moving. You cannot sit here. This space is for transiting from place of capital to place of capital, to consuming, or going home, going to work. This is not a place where you live. Where you live is where you pay to live. And if you don't pay to live there, then we're going to come with our guns and we're going to kick you out. So it's squatting is, screw that. We're gonna take this place and we're gonna live here because we're human beings and we have a right to live here and have shelter.
There have been several groups throughout history who have attempted to reclaim public spaces without permission in order to fulfill their mission. One such group is called the Space Hijackers, who are based in England. The Space Hijackers state, "Our group is dedicated to battling the constant oppressive encroachment onto public spaces of institutions, corporations, and urban planners. We oppose the way that public space is being eroded and replaced by corporate profit-making space. We oppose the way that users of space are being put under increasing scrutiny and control by those who own or run it. Space is designed in order to exert control over its users, for the means of the people who own it. To do this, the services of architects are employed. Architects work by commission. They are presented with a set of requirements and design a space to meet them. Governments and corporations pick our landscape, the stage that affects everything that we do, from designs which by their very nature attempt to withdraw all human life and present empty, pure space. The space hijackers have been responsible for several controversial actions, including protests at the 2012 Olympic Games, throwing disco parties for hundreds of people on subway lines, and using parking meter space as rented office space. The environmental movement that spread across the United States in the 1960s and 70s spawned several divergent philosophies and belief systems. One popular ideology that sprang forth was the deep ecology philosophy. It is characterized by its advocacy of the inherent worth of living beings, regardless of their instrumental utility to human needs, and advocacy for a radical restructuring of modern human societies in accordance with such ideas. Deep ecology espouses three simple propositions. 1. Wilderness preservation. 2. Human population control. 3. Simple living or treading lightly on the planet. Deep ecology supports the view of ecologist and conservationist Aldo Leopold that humans are plain members of the biotic community, and a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. The central spiritual tenet of deep ecology is that the human species is a part of the earth, not separate from it. And as such, human existence is dependent on the diverse organisms within the natural world, each playing a role in the natural economy of the biosphere. The deep ecology philosophy helped inspire more radical anarchist groups like Earth First and the Earth Liberation Front, which we will discuss later. Ecofeminism was another movement that sprang forth in the 1970s. Ecofeminism proposed that there are particular and significant connections between women and nature. Ecofeminism interprets their repression and exploitation in terms of the repression and exploitation of the environment. Ecofeminists believe that these connections are illustrated through traditionally female values, such as reciprocity, nurturing, and cooperation, which are present both among women and in nature. Women in nature are also united through their shared history of oppression by a patriarchal Western society. Vandana Shiva is a physicist, activist, and ecofeminist. Shiva has suggested that a more sustainable and productive approach to agriculture can be achieved through reinstating a system of farming in India that is more centered on engaging women. Shiva has said, "We are either going to have a future where women lead the way to make peace with the earth, or we are not going to have a human future at all." Shiva has been a major proponent of organic farming, fair trade, intellectual property rights, and biodiversity. She dedicated her efforts towards sustainable agriculture after the gas leak in Bhopal from Union Carbide's pesticide manufacturing plant. The Bhopal disaster is considered one of the world's worst industrial disasters. Over 500,000 people were injured by toxic chemicals and thousands died. Central to Shiva's work is the idea of seed freedom, or the rejection of corporate patents on seeds. She calls the patenting of life biopiracy and has fought against attempted patents of several indigenous plants. According to Shiva, the creation of seed monopolies, the destruction of alternatives, the collection of super profits in the form of royalties, and the increasing vulnerability of monocultures has created a context for debt, suicides, and agrarian distress. She has also been a proponent of sustainable design for cities. Shiva says, "In my opinion, a sustainable city is really a city that functions like a cluster of villages, in the sense that each part of it is self-reliant and self-sufficient, that you should be able to walk out of your house and find your groceries and the laundry and everything else you need for everyday living. Basically, a density of occupation, a multifunctionality and density of use, both to liberate space and to create community." The environmental movement in the 1960s helped inspire generations to address the looming challenges that faced the planet. The first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970. The Greenpeace organization was founded in 1971 and is dedicated to nonviolent action. People began building off-the-grid homes, started recycling programs, legislation like the Endangered Species Act were passed, and the public at large became aware of the mounting planetary challenges humankind faced. Eventually, movements like environmental justice were launched to end environmental racism and prevent low-income and minority communities from an unbalanced exposure to highways, garbage dumps, and factories. The environmental justice movement seeks to link social and ecological environmental concerns, while at the same time preventing de facto racism and classism. Environmental discrimination has historically been evident in the process of selecting and building environmentally hazardous sites, including waste disposal, manufacturing, and energy production facilities. The location of transportation infrastructure, including highways, ports, and airports, has also been viewed as a source of environmental injustice. Among the earliest documentation of environmental racism was a study of the distribution of toxic waste sites across the United States. Due to the results of that study, waste dumps and waste incinerators have been the target of environmental justice lawsuits and protests. The environmental justice movement was also launched to combat environmental elitism. In 1994, the Irish political activist Alexander Cockburn noted, "The mainstream environmental movement was elitist, highly paid, detached from the people, indifferent to the working class, and a firm ally of big government." The environmental movement is now accurately perceived as just another well-financed and cynical special interest group. its rancid infrastructure supported by Democratic Party operatives and millions in grants from corporate foundations. While the majority of environmentalist organizations are peaceful, there has arisen a small radical minority that has advocated direct action to protect the environment. The militant environmental group Earth First was founded in 1980 by radicals who considered mainstream environmental groups, the Sierra Club and Greenpeace, as sellouts. Earth First was inspired by Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, Aldo Leopold's Land Ethic, and Edward Abbey's novel The Monkey Wrench Gang. The militant group's motto is, "No compromise in the defense of Mother Earth." In the 1980s, Earth First directed their actions towards old-growth logging, the construction of dams, and other forms of development that they considered destructive to the planet. Earth First members, many of whom are anarchists, have used tree sitting, blockades, and sabotage to wreak havoc against their adversaries. One of its spin-off groups would eventually become the top domestic terrorist group by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Deep green resistance movements all share some common goals and ideas. They argue that the rich and powerful must be stopped from destroying the planet, that communities need to be rebuilt sustainably, and that direct actions against strategic infrastructure must take place. The radicals claim that the term sustainability has been hijacked by corporations and deluded progressives who believe that recycling, renewable energy, and lifestyle changes will get us out of this mess. Militant ideology contends that industrialization is an ecological serial killer, that cities sever people from the land and set up stratified and militarized civilizations, and that monumental architecture and propaganda is created to enforce hierarchy and regulation. The Earth Liberation Front, also known as ELF, has no formal leadership, membership, or official spokesperson and is entirely decentralized, instead consisting of individuals or cells who choose the term as a banner to use.
Yeah, I think you can look back to like the anti-nuclear movement in the 1980s, and I think that had a lot of anarchist involvement when that was going on. It was back then, anarchists were, a lot known as kind of like peacenik hippie people, and they had a lot of involvement in that movement. And then eventually that grew into things like Earth First and Earth First. People like Judy Berry, who was leading a lot of the protests around, anti-logging campaigns here in the Northwest, and pretty prolific, work and advocacy fighting to defend the forests. They came out of Earth First. A lot of anarchist participation there, and obviously you end up seeing things like the ELF and have a lot of anarchists were a part of that as well. And so I think anarchists have, especially in the United States, always really been working for and trying to defend the environment. And again, you can look all the way back to Henry David Thoreau, and a lot of these kind of in American heroes had a lot of anarchist leanings.
I think it's true that there are many misrepresentations of environmentalists, be they radical, anarchist, or mainstream, as well as social movements more generally within the media. There's a lot of reasons for that. I think we can think about the interests that own media and what role or agenda they might have in representing some of these social forces within our society. But I think what's critical for me when thinking about those representations is that they only really show the tip of the iceberg. And even though the actions are misrepresented, those actions themselves, even if appropriately represented, are really only a part of what's really happening within these social movements, particularly within movements that are inspired or connected in some ways to anarchist ideas, to different forms of environmental thinking. What to me is always absent from the media representations is the way in which these organizations, these individuals, and these movements are engaged in a highly democratic, deliberative process as part of what they're doing. So while often these groups are saying no, trying to oppose oil terminals that will impact the climate in communities nearby them, or preventing the construction of new freeways and sprawl in a city, they are also articulating a yes in the way in which they do that work.
Most Americans recognize that our political system is pretty broken at this point, and what semblance of an actual democracy that we once had is pretty broken. The average person is increasingly kind of alienated from the democratic process in the country, and so I think when we look at countries across the world that don't have real democracies, we look at Egypt and Mubarak when he was in control back in 2011 in the Arab Spring, and people praise the people that are in the streets throwing Molotovs at the cop cars there. In the United States, leaders are praising the people in the streets, and we look at it happening in Algeria or somewhere like that, and we send weapons to them. People in Syria, the United States government sends weapons to them and firearms to assist those Molotov cocktail wielding kids in the streets. But then again, when we look at the same people doing those types of activities in a country that's a geopolitical ally of the United States, like Saudi Arabia, it's a very different approach. These people are terrorists. We don't support them. So, I think one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, and it's all subjective, but I think most anarchists are interested in working with people in a way that's, creating a more livable space, that's creating communities where we can live free of hierarchy, and where we actually have a say in how our communities look and the spaces that we live in and how they're organized and how we're going to work and live together, as opposed to what we have today. Are we thinking 4 generations ahead? How are our lives going to look for the youth and the children of the youth 4 generations from today? And I think those are things that people need to start thinking about, that I think a lot of anarchists are asking those questions of what is the world that we're going to leave behind, and what is the world that we want to live in.
Environmentalism advocates the lawful preservation, restoration, and improvement of the natural environment to minimize pollution and protect plant and animal diversity. Environmentalism is an attempt to balance relations between humans and the various natural systems on which they depend in such a way that all the components are accorded a proper degree of sustainability. Many of the environmentalist renegades and radicals that we have discussed have used unorthodox and nonconformist actions to achieve their intended goals. From DeCarlo's participatory architecture to Shiva's eco-feminist farming theories, there is a strong undercurrent of progressive ideals that connects these renegades. The future of the built environment will be influenced by these rebels and other like-minded individuals. We end our presentation today with a quote by primatologist and activist Diane Fossey, who said, "When you realize the value of all life, you dwell less on what is past and concentrate more on the preservation of the future."